Good evening, everybody. It's a Stepping Stones to Awareness show. I'm Caroline Stevens, and tonight I've got Tony Gosling from Bristol on Skype. Now, Tony and I first met each other in April. He actually interviewed me. Now, the boot's on the other foot. I'm going to interview Tony. And I'm going to have lots of pleasure in this, Tony, because I'm going to give you some really difficult questions. So, without further ado, I'm going to speak to Tony. Tony, over to you. Welcome.
Hi, Caroline.
I saw your interview with Kerry Cassidy the other night, and it was about Brexit. So, Kerry, I've interviewed Kerry. She's been in the studios. What did you tell her about Brexit that you'd like to share with our audience tonight?
Well, a few things, really. One, I suppose, is the backdrop to this whole procedure has been stage managed by Brussels. It's quite clear that the process of a negotiation has been framed by them, and where any kind of Prime Minister with a backbone would have been battling with the EU in order to shape the framework of the negotiations, but actually it's all been set by them. And this whole business, I think the biggest farce of the entire negotiation, I mean, of course it's going to be difficult. No one was going to pretend otherwise. It's like the difference between a marriage and a divorce. Very easy to fall in love, get married, go down the aisle, actually relatively simple. But when it comes to a divorce, it's bound to be difficult. And it always was going to be difficult. But the main, I suppose, way that Brexit, the guns of Brexit were spiked by Theresa May was agreeing to the no border in Northern Ireland, what they call a frictionless border, which really means no border. And that was suicidal. I mean, from Britain's point of view, because it meant that the Conservatives, a minority party at Westminster, have alienated all the people that they need to get a deal through. So it's not going to happen. Their deal is not going to happen. As soon as they went, down that road, that was a given, and that was the beginning of this year. It was all that was all signed off and sealed and everything. So for a whole year, we've been dancing around a totally undoable deal. So I said a lot to Kerry the other day, but that I think is part of the crux of it, along with the explanation of the Bank of England's role in all of this, which has been appalling. Mark Carney, the governor, has basically been a spin doctor for Mario Draghi at the European Central Bank in Frankfurt, who basically he is. Along with Donald Tusk, they are the kings of Europe, the dukes and the kings of Europe. They decide everything. They now decide who is going to be allowed to be a chancellor or finance minister in a European country. The Italians have had a finance minister foisted on them by Draghi. He says, no, well, you can't have that person because I don't like them. And so he's got a veto on who are going to be the finance ministers, that kind of thing. So that's where we're at, really, with the central bank here in Britain actually working for the other side. Well,
I think after the vote, and I was interviewed by Radio Wiltshire, then the following month, alarm bells started ringing for me because we turned down 200 experienced trade negotiators from New Zealand. So I'm thinking, well, why would we do that if we were seriously leaving? And then, do you remember that TTIP where everybody was protesting in the streets about transatlantic trade and investment partnership and the ISDS clause, which basically put all our corporations, well, it was basically a globalist charter, wasn't it, to take over the UK? And I approached Jacob Rees-Mogg in the October and said, hang on, if we're supposed to be leaving, why is it that our Parliament has rubber stamped something called the Canadian Trade Deal, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, which is like TTIP? And Jacob Rees-Mogg couldn't answer, but they've managed to kick the can into the long grass, leave it as long as possible to sign over, trigger Article 50. And then, according to our sources, Whitehall's not been preparing for Brexit at all. What do you think to that?
That's part of the tactics of the May government, is that they want to make sure there is no preparation whatsoever for a no deal, which makes, if there is a no deal, which looks increasingly likely, it means that it's a disaster for Britain. So this is where, I mean, actually, what she's been doing is, it's not surprising some people call her Treason May, because actually she should, and right from the very start, from day one, as soon as she got in as Prime Minister, she should have had a whole, and David Davis and Dominic Raab, the rest of them, the people who've had to leave over the incompetence of the Prime Minister, trying to sort of control the negotiations from on high. If she was a decent person, she would have allowed the Brexit ministers, secretaries to get on with the job, not try and micromanage them. And of course, it doesn't mean her micromanaging her. It's the civil servants micromanaging her. And we've lost, by the way, in his death in his mid-50s, the Cabinet Secretary a couple of months ago, a very premature death, a suspicious death, I think it's fair to say, of the Cabinet Secretary. So there's obviously, problems at the top, and particularly with Theresa trying to tell these various Brexit secretaries what to do. So they are doing all of the groundwork, collecting all the evidence, and supplying Theresa May with the strategy, saying, well, this is what we should do. And all of them have been ignored over preparations for no deal. Because, of course, if there's no preparations for no deal, it means that you haven't got a strong negotiating position. So this is basic stuff that she hasn't done, and she's deliberately not done it. And I think you've got to look at who is she's working for. Most of what she's been doing has been in Brussels' favour. So this is why you've got all, Barnier, Tusk, and the rest of them smirking on the TV. Oh, we're not going to renegotiate now. They do seem to be running the show. And, so she should be absolutely ashamed. And this is why there's also a faction that's built up of these former ministers, particularly David Davis and Dominic Raab, who, there's many others as well, of course, around the European Research Group, who have got completely different ideas. But her not preparing is a disaster in itself. It's almost as if they want to make sure that there is no alternative to accepting this deal.
Well, what's really interesting is the fact that she called the general election in 2017. Suddenly she had this aberration that she needed the people's mandate to lead this country. But yet we knew 4 months before that she was calling the general election. So she actually had some foresight, didn't she? It was only made public at the very last possible time. But the Conservative Party, HQ, knew she was calling the election. So it was all just to cause a bit more mayhem, wasn't it?
Well, mayhem, very good pun there. Okay, so you're absolutely right. It was an insane time to call an election. Absolutely bonkers. I think most people at the time knew, if you've got a decent majority, what on earth do you think you're doing trying to call a general election? So it didn't do her any favours at all. And it just meant that, really, it's incredible to think that she's still, even now, the leader of the Conservative Party after a disastrous set of Brexit negotiations, and also that disastrous general election that she called. She should have been out as soon as that general election campaign was over. They should have had a leadership election.
Absolutely.
She should have resigned. What she's doing now is she's clinging on to power. It's back to Star Trek with the Klingons. She is clinging on as hard as she possibly can. And that, of course, is bad for the Conservative Party, and it's bad for the country. I predicted we may see, it's just possible, we may see her resign anyway, even though she won the confidence vote, with, by the way, a 2/3 majority, as various people from the European Research Group have pointed out, of backbenchers in voting in favour of her leaving. It was, I mean, overall, it's interesting. The figures are 317 Tory MPs, but there are, out of those, there's 140 paid posts, which are in the Prime Minister's gift. So they're basically Theresa May's paid hangers-on, 140 of those. And now that's all sorts of things like, minor ministers, etc., right up to cabinet ministers. And they're all paid extra for those extra little jobs that they get to do. Hangers-on for the government and for the party. So then there's 177 backbench MPs. So you've got 140 paid posts and 177 backbench MPs, which makes 317 total. So the number that voted to remove her is 117, and that is 2/3 of the backbenchers. So, and her majority was only 2/3 of the total. So it's not a very good majority. It's certainly not a vote of confidence. I mean, even though it was officially a vote of confidence, she's scraped through really, and it's pretty certain at some point. I mean, I honestly don't know. We may see her trying to cling on to power, as these failed politicians do at Brussels. So what you're seeing a very similar kind of behaviour by Theresa May to the likes of Peter Mandelson, of Neil Kinnock, all these totally failed, Chris Patten, right? Leon Britton, all these failed British politicians that then go to become European commissioners. She is behaving exactly like them by trying to cling on to power, even though it's quite clear she's in the way of both her own party and the country.
Well, it's interesting. We talk about Theresa May, but look at who else is left anyway. You've got David Davis is a member of the 300 Club, isn't he? You've got...
Look, let's cut to the chase, because the real favourite by far is Boris. And that is another reason, potentially, why the 317 Tory MPs voted for May, because it's a bit like the American elections with the alternative of Trump and Hillary. They've got the alternative of Theresa May or Boris. So it's not exactly a great ringing endorsement for democracy when you've got that sort of awful choice. And I'm quite certain that if it had been other people had been front runners, possibly others that had managed to make it through. I'm not sure who exactly, but if there'd been somebody other than Boris who was the front runner, you may well have found, and someone with a bit of personality, obviously not Sahid Javid. There are all sorts of people who've managed to squirm their way up the greasy pole, like Philip Hammond and Gavin Williams, and the various senior people who've held senior office, but they've got no personality. And so it's almost as if you're not allowed to get to senior office in this country unless you've got no personality anymore, because then someone might be a contender against Boris. That seems to be the way we run things here in the Conservative Party. And that's because all of those promotions have been made over the last 2 years or so by Theresa May. And when I say by Theresa May, I mean she is a kind of securocrat candidate. So remember, she was very, very close to MI5 for many years, being Home Secretary. So, basically doing whatever MI5 advised her to do. And she did. She's brought in all sorts of terrible legislation as Prime Minister.
Well, she was the person, her and Cameron had actually authorised... Oh, sorry.
To do with surveillance. Also, remember what happened to the Her Watch, even though it's not her direct responsibility as Home Secretary. She made a total mess of the prisons. I mean, it's basically like going back to Victorian times, being sent to prison nowadays, the privatisations of the prisons, this kind of thing. And so she's been very, very close to the Secret Services, particularly the MI5, the security service, who, by the way, are implicated in terrorism here in the UK, where all these people they're supposed to be following, oh dear, they forget to follow them. They don't check to see if they're getting guns, explosives, bullets, this sort of thing. And we get all these terrorist attacks every single time, pretty much, over the last 3 or 4 years, and even back to the 2005 London bombings. You can see the fingerprints of MI5 all over these various so-called terrorists. And I would suggest that the anti-terror hotline is actually a recruitment for terrorism rather than a way of trying to stop it, because all of the terrorists last year in the run up to the general election were all people who'd been, all the ringleaders anyway, who'd been reported to the anti-terror hotline, and yet there they turn up committing terrorist attacks. So this is the world in which Theresa May has been working and operating, and we need to see her, I think, as the securocrat's choice for Prime Minister. And that's why I think she's made such a mess of this, is because she's much more loyal to the military-industrial complex than the security complex than she is to the people.
Well, she's never been talking about the defence side of things, has she? The fact that we're supposed to be handing over our military to Brussels. I mean, that's a big issue, and that's been a deal done behind closed doors.
Well, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, certainly my understanding is that one of the main reasons we've had Brexit is because the British military are not prepared to merge with the militaries of the other countries in Europe, that they've had some bad experiences working with the military. I mean, for example, we've had many years now, probably 5 or 6 years, of various exchange deals between the French military and Britain, where you have, French military brigade spotted driving down one of the motorways to do a joint exercise up the M5 or whatever. And they've had bad experiences working with these other militaries in the British military, and so they've decided. I mean, I'm not talking about the Ministry of Defence necessarily. I'm talking about the actual senior officers and the chiefs of staff of the military have had a bad experience with that. And so I think that's been one of the motivating factors behind Brexit, and in fact even getting the vote in the first place. So I'm not so sure about this whole thing as Britain is going to merge with all the other militaries of Europe, because I'm not even sure that most of the other members of the EU will stomach having their militaries merged together, as Macron and Merkel have been trumpeting over the last month or so. I don't think it's quite possible that simply won't happen.
Well, the troops were spotted landing in Bosnia a few weeks ago wearing EU logos on their arms.
Well,
there was a big outcry.
We saw armoured cars in Paris last week.
That's right. Yeah.
With the European Union flags on. So they're trying to do this slowly and surely by stealth. I don't think there's any pulling the wool over the eyes of the senior generals and the colonels and the field marshals in the military. They are a little bit uncomfortable about doing this sort of thing, and I think that may actually be, should we say, a treaty too far, that actually means that the EU is going to. I mean, we've already seen the European Union starting to fragment. The fact that you've got such powerful movements in Southern Europe saying we've had enough of the European Union. And what they're doing, of course, is they're denying any kind of referendum or any kind of choice to these countries. I mean, even Britain, who's been allowed this referendum, we're now being told, oh, well, hang on, we might have to reverse this, and maybe we won't do Brexit. And as Rees-Mogg has pointed out, well, OK, well, you can ignore democracy, fine, but that means you're living in a dictatorship.
So do you think a lot of the MPs will try to overturn the Article 50 and will have all the MPs being sent back to Brussels in May?
Well, look, it's really difficult, this crystal ball gazing, but I would say I think the most likely is we will have Theresa May probably, although it may be that there's some sort of, she just throws in the towel and lets Boris manage it, who knows. But, and I hate to say that because I'd much rather see one of the other top, most experienced former cabinet ministers take over from her.
Who would you like to see?
I mean, almost any of them, really. But, I mean, I would say, for me, the most articulate and also the most left-wing, that is to say the least, shall we say, xenophobic of them, is David Davis. I think he'd make a very good leader. Also, Dominic Raab's been very good. He's very articulate. I like to see someone who can string two words together. What about Rees-Mogg? I mean, OK, so he's not been in the cabinet, but I think he's someone who commands respect. This is what we want. We don't want somebody who's just simply a gopher for the security services as Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister's job comes with a lot of patronage, and she gets a lot of power, to appoint all sorts of senior people without having to consult anybody else. It's just down to her, although maybe the Queen, actually. It'd be nice to see someone who's just a little bit more personable, rather than someone that looks like a puppet. I mean, she just does look like she looks like a puppet. that's just all I can say about her. So I think it may be her, it may be Boris. With a bit of luck, it might be somebody else seeing Brexit through. But it looks to me as if what we're going to get is some kind of deal, which includes the DUP helping the Tory party vote it through, but with some kind of compromise over the Irish backstop and possibly even a hard border between the North and Southern Ireland. Although the EU won't like that, I think it's a very strong moral point that the whole world can see, that how on earth can the EU demand that we break up the United Kingdom as part of the deal? I don't think they can. I mean, it's just not morally, it's morally reprehensible to allow that to happen. I mean, I actually personally believe in United Ireland. I think that'd be lovely to see, but this is not the way to go about it. I think that's a really, in the future, let that happen. It's also interesting, isn't it, how for the last, now, hang on, I'm trying to think, it's nearly 2 years, there's been no meeting of Stormont at the Irish Parliament. How very, very convenient. Because you imagine if they were meeting now with the DUP and Sinn Féin arguing the toss about the Irish border and saying, no, you can't do this, yes, you can do that, or whatever, that would have been a major thorn in the side of Theresa May's little time bomb in order to try and stop Brexit. So I think that was construed, and maybe even Sinn Féin were involved in construing that in order to try and guarantee that the EU could get this, spike the guns of the Brits and say, oh, we're going to put this little clause into the withdrawal agreement where you have to have an open border between the North and Southern Ireland. I think, this is a bad way to do things. And people say, oh, well, there may be, return to violence in Northern Ireland. I'll tell you what might bring a return to violence, and that's if you shut down their parliament. And they have done now for 2 years.
Well, talking about violence, looking across the water and seeing what's happening in France with the yellow vests, do you think it's going to happen here?
No. You know why? It's because the French have been schooled in this kind of activity for decades. And they are very, shall we say, better organised than here in Britain. And that isn't necessarily because we don't have the potential to be organised here. I think there's a tremendous amount of secret state interference particularly in the left-wing movements and in alternative movements, grassroots political movements here. I mean, we've seen, haven't we, even with the environmentalists, the protesters against the coal-fired power stations, that sort of thing, have been having police spies actually running these organisations, controlling them. So that's the way that the British secret state has been really audacious, and I would argue criminal. These people should have gone to jail. The police that ordered these infiltrations should have gone to jail. So you'll find not only is the British character a little bit more reticent than the French, who are much more demonstrative, the sort of Catholics, Southern Europeans are a little bit more like that, but there has been a great deal of effort, I think, in this country and public money put into quelling any possibility of some sort of public unrest. I mean, particularly through groups like the Socialist Workers' Party, who were, and certainly their newspaper is very good. It's there's all sorts of interesting stuff in it. But as a force, they've been massively infiltrated by the security services. And we heard this when the two MI5 officers, Annie Machon and David Shayler, came out in the late 1990s. There was, I think they said, 50-something agents in the Socialist Workers' Party. So you may go to a Socialist Workers' Party meeting and find most of the people in the room with you are working for MI5.
Well, you could say that about all these groups, though. I mean, they're all controlled opposition at the end of the day. I mean, let's.
Well, I say some are, some aren't, and it's very difficult to know. We've got to be quite specific about, where there's evidence, where it's been provided by MI5 officers themselves. For example, with the Socialist Workers' Party, we can say that specifically. We got the police spies. We can say that specifically with specific environmental campaigns and social justice campaigns, like, for example, the Stephen Lawrence campaign. I mean, I think anybody who ordered infiltration of that campaign to get justice for Stephen should be arrested and should be put on trial. I think that the people behind the institution of the flammable cladding at Grenfell Tower should be arrested. They should be interviewed and they should be put on trial. For maybe for manslaughter, something like that. But we don't get that in this country. I'm afraid there's a very, very poor criminal justice system, and quite often my suspicions are that there are secret links really between the Tory party and the establishment and the top judges and the people that run the courts, and maybe through Freemasonry, maybe through other means, in order to really just to protect people, basically. So if you're in the club, basically it's a kind of get out of jail free card. You can do what you want, and that means, of course, a lot of senior police officers are given a lot more freedom to do what they want rather than to obey the law. We even heard just a few days ago at GCHQ, one of the former directors of GCHQ was saying, oh, well, GCHQ can hack anybody they want to. They don't have to obey the law. We heard earlier this year that MI5 can do the same. That they have immunity from prosecution. This is all effectively under Crown immunity. So we have a totally broken criminal justice system, and our legal system is not keeping up with the technology. This is crucial. So you've got all sorts of technology out there which basically is not covered by the law, and that's one of the reasons why I think we need to concentrate not on doing what Europe wants or whatever and taking our laws from Europe, but we need to focus very, very firmly on Westminster and making sure that our laws are updated regularly. Our parliamentarians are concentrating on what's going on in society and making new laws for us, and forget having to do all these negotiations with foreign powers. Obviously we want to get on with our neighbours, but we need, I think, to avoid this whole concentration of power, the massive concentration of power, particularly the 850 million people or so there are living under the EU edicts and being run by all these failed politicians. The European Commission are almost every single one of them is a politician who's been kicked out by the public.
But do you think it's fair that the MPs, when they enter the House, have vested interests which conflict with their duty? So you've got all these people in the Tory party, just as well as the Labour Party. They've all got shares, money, stocks and shares in the City of London, corporations, shell corporations. I mean, where do we, they've got shares in green energy, and then they go on these committees and, they get £50,000, £100,000 for a 2-hour speech.
Let's not go over the top here, because everybody's got interests. And I think everybody should be allowed to be an MP. So if you've got some sort of interest, doesn't mean to say you can't be an MP. The most important thing is, the law actually is that if you have those interests, you must declare them. And if you're making a decision where those interests come into play, you should step aside and you should not take part in that decision. You can take part in a discussion and debate, but you shouldn't be part of any kind of vote on a decision. And I think if you do, then that should be malfeasance. That's, a criminal offence. If you are involved in voting for something which is getting you money, you shouldn't be sitting around the table. And in fact, certainly my experience of most meetings of boards and councils, say for example with planning, is that someone who's got a specific interest in planning, if it's revealed, will have to step out of the meeting at the crucial point. But the problem, of course, is where you've got secret societies and where those links and those interests are not revealed. And of course, one of the basic things we need in this country, and every country should have it, Singapore's got it, by the way, is a declaration of interests on secret societies. If you're in a secret society, you should have that down on paper. We used to have to do that here in Bristol. There was a little gap on the register of interest forms for the councillors, and a certain councillor for the Tory party, Jack Lepresti, he put in his little box, I am a Freemason, but it's not a secret society. So at least he declared the fact that he was. And I wonder if there aren't other Freemasons, even at the time, that just simply put nothing in the box because they knew that it would be very difficult for anyone to find out if they were a Mason or not.
Yeah, there's a lot of Freemasonry, for sure. You know that the UK is a corporation, so when we've got all these courts not working in the people's interests, they're corporations too. And this is a big problem now. We're privatising everything.
But the reason that's happening is because of lobbying by those corporate interests. And I think, largely Brussels represents those corporate interests too. It's very, very, very powerful, cartel influenced. And for anybody that hasn't seen it, you must see the documentary. Do you know the one I'm talking about? It's called The Brussels Business. And it is one of the best documentaries you'll ever watch about what really goes on in Brussels. So I'm suspicious of all politicians, but at least, if we have a Westminster government, we have a chance of scrutinising them. Way over there in Brussels, we've got no chance at all.
Well, I might disagree with you on that. I do think that there's a lot of Brexit MPs that have too many vested interests in actually staying within the EU bubble as well. They've been supportive of the Canadian TTIP by the backdoor deal. And to me, you can't cherry pick. You either regain your sovereignty, and that means, our military staying in the UK and being able to control our borders, or we give it away to Brussels. There's no halfway house. You can't cherry pick.
Well, some of those so-called Brexit MPs may not really be Brexiteers. They
Absolutely.
may be Remainers. They may be Remainiacs.
Well,
the people that want a second vote, the people's vote, so-called people's vote, which is really the loser's vote. That is, to me, it's incredible. We had on our radio show I do here in Bristol, if I can give a plug for it, online at thisweek.org.uk. We had a clip last week from Channel 4 News where Matt Fry was up in Northumbria chatting to a whole load of factory workers, a big crowd of them. One of the questions he put was, how many of you, put your hands up, like the school children, put your hands up if you want to have a second vote, a people's vote. And out of the crowd of about 30 people, one person put their hand up. And he said, what, one person? You're kidding me. You've got to be kidding me. Like, John McEnroe. Are you serious? And so there you go. It's around, I would suggest round about that sort of figure, maybe, 2 or 3% of people actually want the people's vote. And yet in the media, every day, day after day, day after day. And of course, it's not really a people's vote, it's this kind of slogan. We've had a people's vote, and yet the press just pick it up and use it as if it's the best term to use. A bit like whether you use the term government or regime. I would use the word regime to describe Theresa May's way of government. Look, she's appointed Gavin Williams, for God's sake, as Defence Secretary. The guy can hardly string two words together, and he says, Putin, I wish he would shut up and go away. This is not diplomatic speak, and it doesn't carry any weight whatsoever in the wider world. It just makes Britain a laughingstock. So that's where we are, and we need to get to, I think, a more, shall we say, statesmanly, people with a bit of gravitas and a bit of morality in our central government. And the thing is, of course, that it will be easy for Jeremy Corbyn to get in if we end up with a bunch of people like Theresa May, and the sorts of people she's now collecting around her are really I don't mean to be rude to say this, but it's the dregs of the Tory party she's gathering around her now as part of her government. Nobody really wants to be associated with her. They're all looking to the future.
I would say we live in a dictatorship. And by the way, you've not mentioned the UN Migration Pact that's already been signed and was never debated in Parliament. So there was thousands and thousands of people signed an e-petition for an event that's already happened. So were you aware that we'd signed that?
Yeah, but I just don't think it's anywhere near as important as the real political drama that's being played out at the moment between Brussels and Westminster. And, the battle, I suppose, for what is going to be the final result of all of this. We've got the main problem as well is, I've been having a go at Theresa May quite a lot. And, of course, she's going to be history at some point. Basically, she's crashing and burning. I would say she's got probably a few little bits of metal left on her superstructure as she's burning up in re-entry. She's not got a lot of time left. And this is what happens to our politicians now in this cynical world, is they just do more and more and more terrible things until someone's got to jettison them. What we want is politicians who we can have some sort of and can leave office with a clear conscience that, oh, okay, I've done my best, I've done a good job, rather than the Tony Blair type characters that have to hide under a stone. Her husband, Philip, Theresa May's husband, Philip, works for this as a fund manager for this LA company Capital Group with massive shareholdings in Lockheed Martin, in Amazon, and Starbucks, in all these big tax evasion corporations, the ones that pay hardly any tax. He's making a fortune out of those, and also out of the war in Yemen, where something like £4 billion of contracts have been won to supply the Saudis with bombs, munitions, etc., to kill all these innocent children and country people of the poorest country in the Middle East. And one of the most historic, by the way, with a whole load of UNESCO heritage sites being bombed by our wonderful munitions. And, you know, not to say anything of the biggest cholera outbreak since the Middle Ages. And we're implicated in that, and most directly through Theresa May's husband, Philip, who's personally made millions of pounds out of that war. So this is the sort of dirty politics I would like to see more discussed on our national media, because, of course, they are really culpable in not explaining Brexit, in not going into the detail of the various offers on options of the various offers on the table, or the ones that we could put on the table. But most importantly, they have been coaxing us into these various wars, like the Iraq war, you know, with all that weapons of mass destruction rubbish and all the nonsense about Assad's chemical weapons. That's just lies, more lies, night after night on the national TV news, on all channels, the same lies. So really the media has become the spearhead of the war machine. And so they are absolutely culpable in not only in making a mess, a deliberate mess of Brexit, but also misinforming the public, and also trying to drag us into the next US war that the Americans want. And of course, you know, they're very, very close to some of the British arms firms too, and they really seem to be driving most of our policy. The ordinary people of Britain that hardly get a look in under Theresa May.
Well, that reinforces what I was saying earlier about the vested interests, doesn't it?
Well, it's her. It's her. I mean, this is the tactic is to get somebody in right at the very top, and then it doesn't matter who else is involved.
But you see, I was talking to a politician the other day, and he was saying that when you have a Chancellor of the Exchequer, he's going to make really important decisions which will affect the financial markets. So they will have had a discussion before he speaks, when he's doing his budget, and he might just take his glass and he might cough before he sips, or vice versa. And the globalists know which way to buy and sell the shares and what shares to offload. And that's how it works.
Well, maybe, but I don't know anything about that. I mean, certainly the Bank of England governor is a globalist, isn't he? Mark Carney, with his Bank for International Settlements. I mean, he's a regulator. He's one of the main people who's responsible for the 2008 financial crisis. And wonderful George Osborne from the Bullingdon Club, like Boris, which is, I just call it the Hellfire Club, because it seems very much like the 17th century Hellfire clubs we had in High Wycombe, where it was a similar situation, actually, where the Chancellor had decided to do a whole load of cuts which were a complete disaster for the country. The only thing is, back then he was kicked out because we had a fairly robust political system. Now the political system and the media is far worse, actually, even without all this high tech, than it was back in the Hellfire Club days. And so the Chancellor, George Osborne, put Carney in power after Carney had been running the risk committee at the central bank, the BIS, in Switzerland, which at the Bretton Woods conference after World War II, they passed a resolution to close it down. What happened? It just carried on in a little office over a chocolate shop in Basel, anonymous, you know, for about 30, 40 years. And now we've got this massive tower. It's called the Tower of Basel in Basel. In fact, it's a brilliant book by Adam Libor, a British guy who lives in Hungary now, called The Tower of Basel, which talks about how actually international banking is all totally manipulated, and Carney is one of those. Mervyn King, however, who was around before him, was the son of a railway porter. He was put in his post as governor by Gordon Brown, and actually a brilliant decision, I think, by Brown. You know, maybe just by luck, who knows, but he did, I think, a much better job. The thing is, he was warning about a financial crisis, and he had a lot of problems actually being too political. He wasn't allowed to be whilst he was in post. So he was warning quietly about it, but nobody was listening. And then when it came in 2008, he said that we had to do what we had to do in order to save the economy from the banks. So he was very, very fair in pointing the finger directly at the banks, which Carney never does. Anyway, I'm going to have to go now because time is up. It's now actually nearly 10. And so I'll have to say goodbye. If I can just give my website again, is thisweek.org.uk, and you can, if you're in Bristol, you can listen to us live every Friday between 6 and 8.
Thank you so much, Tony. And I'd like to say thank you to the audience back home for watching. And I hope you come and watch another Stepping Stones to Awareness show very soon. Good night. Thank you, Tony.
Bye.
Bye.